So Taurus and Jupiter. Remember, when we're thinking about how a planet functions for an ascendant, the key thing is to consider, related to that ascendant, where is the planet debilitated and where is the planet exalted? That's number one. You also need to consider what are the houses that the planet rules. What are the houses the planet rules? So for a Taurus ascendant, Jupiter rules over the 8th house and the 11th house. The 8th house and the 11th house. Now, if you study yogas, and you study how yogas function and how they function mathematically, each ascendant has a particular set of planets that function well for it. And the 11th house is often one of the more profound yoga breakers within a person's chart. I mean, good yogas, the things we would typically want. The 8th house is a neutral house, which means that the 8th house lord will act like the other house that the planet rules. So in this case, we have Jupiter ruling the 8th and the 11th house. Since Jupiter rules the 11th, which is the strongest, most difficult, egotistical yoga breaker of the good things that the Taurus is meant to embody in this life, and Jupiter rules the 8th, it means that 8th house lordship becomes difficult as we would imagine it should, but it's mainly because Jupiter also rules the 11th. That's very important to remember when we think about yogas. And again, this is something that we get into more profoundly in, I believe it's the end of year 2 of the astrological apprenticeship program. But what does it mean that Venus, this Venus-ruled sign, Taurus, has Jupiter as the 8th and the 11th lord? Well, the 8th house deals with sudden breaks and changes. Things that sort of come out of nowhere, that were, it's like the kind of individual, it seems like every day some new crisis has occurred. The 8th house is considered to be the bhava of the flaw, against where things break down, but not necessarily the way things break down such that you're expecting it. They come out of nowhere. Where did that? What's that all about? And so Jupiter, being a planet of optimism, of growth, oftentimes of excess, will find that a Taurus ascendant will make a lot of mistakes and have a lot of things go wrong if they focus too much on optimism, on just hoping things are going to go well, on just expecting that they'll be lucky, that things will work out. There's a reason that Jupiter is debilitated in the person's 9th house if you're a Taurus ascendant. Because if you're a Taurus ascendant and when Jupiter is debilitated in the 9th, that shows that you are not necessarily meant to focus on luck and optimism. You're meant to focus on that really good planet for you, which is what? Saturn. And Saturn deals with hard work, discipline, looking to see what the problems are in advance and dealing with them. Taurus ascendants don't necessarily benefit by taking a Jupiterian approach to life. And it's been so long since I've worked on these sessions, I may have mentioned it before, but it's worth repeating. Remember, signs that are ruled by Mercury, Venus, and Saturn, they tend to be ascendants that require an individual to be more down to earth, more grounded, more let's make peace with Vishnu or God as it manifests in this everyday world, in this everyday life. Whereas signs ruled by Moon, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, these are the more idealistic ascendants and signs, which shows a quality of individual who needs to strive for the great ideal even if they fail. Whereas again, Venus-ruled signs, Mercury-ruled signs, Saturn-ruled signs, idealism, it can be okay. You want to have a little bit of idealism. But the main focus for these signs are to simply look around at the world and see what you're supposed to be doing and doing it. Attending to what's happening right here and right now. So I like to look at Venus, Saturn, and Mercury-ruled signs as more of a Buddhist or Zen type of approach. Whereas I look at Sun, Moon, Mars, Jupiter ruled signs. If you know anything about Yogananda, how he was very idealistic and striving and that kind of approach. So keep this in mind. So Taurus ascendants can really have a lot of difficulty, cause a lot of problems in their life if they're always trying to rely on optimism, if they're always trying to rely on luck and grace versus doing the hard work that Saturn calls them to. Jupiter also rules the 11th house, which is a house of titles, achieving our personal dreams, our personal goals, networks and networking, the larger group of our peers, in a sense. And so when Jupiter is activated in unhealthy fashion for a Taurus ascendant, the Taurus ascendant becomes hyperfixated on getting the degree to prove themselves, on getting the title to prove themselves. They become hyperfixated on being the important person in their social network or in their work network, in their larger group of peers. They can become hyperfixated on trying to have all of their personal dreams and desires fulfilled. So the Taurus ascendant who's obsessed with something like The Secret or using one's thoughts and imagination to have all of their dreams and wishes fulfilled, they're working essentially against the blueprint of what it means to be a Taurus ascendant. Always remember, what's one of the better planets for a Taurus ascendant? It's Saturn, which is the hard, dirty work, the service-oriented individual that sees the beauty in the simple things of life, like sweeping the leaves off of the deck, or taking care of their family, or when you think about a mother and all the dirty work that a mother does, it's just part of keeping the child alive and healthy, keeping the family alive and healthy. This is where the strength of Taurus comes into play. It's that Saturn aspect. So we have to be careful with the Taurus ascendant that they don't tap into that Jupiter and become too self-righteous, too idealistic, too focused on fulfilling their own personal needs. And that's also why Taurus ascendants, when they tend towards excess food, excess entertainment, stimulation, luxury, they tend to become obese and they tend to develop Jupiterian diseases, kapha diseases, things of this nature. Which again, we will be discussing Ayurveda and astrology in a series coming up with Nishi Pandit. There's a previous video we just did with him, and he has a great grasp on Ayurveda. And I think it will help us if you listen to these videos and tie it together with the Ayurvedic videos. Ideally, what we'll be able to do is maybe come up with a way to describe a healthy blueprint for each ascendant. So I'll try to remember that as we go through that next series, which will start in a month or two. Now, when we think about Jupiter, remember we have to consider the exaltation and debilitation positions for a Taurus ascendant. So Jupiter is exalted in a Taurus ascendant's third house, right? Jupiter is exalted in Cancer, which is the third house from Taurus. Now that means that, what does the third house represent? It represents our peers, our siblings, our immediate peers and our siblings, not larger groups, but for example, our closer friends, as well as our immediate younger siblings. The third house represents our mind and the things that are of interest to us. The third house is often related to the things that we do with our hands, how creative we are, our hobbies, and so on. So Taurus ascendant benefits by remaining very mentally open. Jupiter is a planet of expansiveness, of seeing the bigger picture. And the third house is specifically a house of the mind. A Taurus ascendant can also be benefited by having lots of hobbies, by exploring different mental interests that they have. They're usually very good with their hands as well. They often make very good musicians, or any kind of hobby or skill, because remember the third house deals with skills, that relates to using the hands. And they're usually extremely knowledgeable about whatever hobby or skill they take up. So when we think about Jupiter, we often think about Jupiter as wanting to direct someone to a greater sense of religiosity or spirituality or faith, when really, for a Taurus ascendant, they're meant to develop skills, to have a broad understanding of skills. They're meant to expand their mind, to see all the different points of view that people have. A Taurus ascendant who uses their Jupiter well will not be self-righteous. They will not be fanatical. They will be able to see and understand the mental positions of everyone. And they won't be upset by it. They'll be able to say to someone, okay, well, you believe in flat earth theory. I don't get it, but that's great. I see that that is your paradigm, that is your vision, that is your view in life, and you'll be able to be respectful to the individual. Or if you're a flat earther, you'll be able to look at someone who has the crazy idea that the earth is round, a globe, and you'll be able to say, well, okay, based on my understanding of how this functions, I think you're crazy and you should really rethink this, but I love you anyway, and I realize that we all have different perspectives. That's a healthy use of Jupiter for a Taurus ascendant. Now, when we think about Jupiter being debilitated in the 9th house, again, consider the 9th house. Philosophy, idealism, grace, religion, things of this nature. And when Jupiter is debilitated in the 9th, it shows a person who is not meant to define themselves by some sort of religious measure. They're not meant to define themselves through some sort of faith that they impress upon others, push upon others. And that's the key there. It doesn't mean you're not meant to have faith. It's just the idea of sharing faith and making sure that everyone around you has the same faith. That's not the strong point of a Taurus ascendant. That's a negative aspect of a Taurus ascendant. That's when Jupiter becomes imbalanced. So Taurus, when we really look at how Jupiter functions by house, lord, rulership, and by the exaltation, debilitation placements of Jupiter, we get a healthier sense of Taurus. Just like a Taurus would typically do well to be with a partner that they share a lot of interests with, that they are interested in talking to their spouse about things that are important to them. And I use the word trivia here, or trivial, not in the way we typically think of it, but just simply on a more mundane level, like enjoying the simplicity of life. Like a Taurus ascendant does better if they find their spirituality going dancing with their spouse versus dragging their spouse to church and making sure they understand the doctrine. So when you have a Taurus ascendant who is hell-bent on having a spiritual partner that believes everything they do, that's setting oneself up for difficulty. And that's going to be for anybody, not just partners in marriage. It will be friends. It will be any kind of relationship. But a Taurus ascendant which is able to find a way to appreciate God in taking their spouse out to dinner, or going and playing darts with their friends, or going camping with their friends. These more basic here and now things, that's what's going to create a greater sense of peace and joy in faith, faith in the goodness of life, faith in the goodness of the world for a Taurus ascendant when it comes to their relationships and their path in life in general. So keep this in mind as you think about Jupiter for a Taurus ascendant.